Beloveds, these are powerful words. And I want to look at them a little more closely as we consider how we can best be allies in this work for freedom, in this work for equality, in this work to build the beloved community. And when I say best be allies, I know that we are not all white in this congregation, but we are predominantly white, and I am talking to the white folks today. I am talking to all of us, of course, but a lot of what I'm saying, quite a lot of what I'm saying is for the white folks today, for us to learn how to be better allies. Reverend Dr. King wrote this in the style of one of Paul's epistles. Now, if you're not very familiar with the epistles, with the letters, with the stuff at the back of your Bible, if you have one, these are letters that Paul wrote. He wrote a lot of them, and others are just attributed to him. But these are letters that Paul wrote to churches in a wide area in his time, and he was exhorting them to be better Christians because they were Christian churches. And so he talks in this letter a lot about being Christians, and he talks about being a Christian nation. He does that because he's writing in the style of Paul, and he wrote it for the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So whenever we read Paul's actual letters, understand that we are reading other people's mail. And when we are reading this, we are reading something that Reverend Dr. King wrote for a specific church at a specific time. So don't get hung up. Don't get hung up on the parts where he talks about a Christian nation, because beloveds, you know that Reverend Dr. King did so much work across all faith traditions, and he did it really well. This was for a very particular audience. So let's look at the meat of this letter. First, he talks about whether our moral and spiritual progress has been outpaced by our scientific progress. Well, this was in 1956. And aren't we seeing the fruits of that today? Aren't we seeing the fruits of that today? Just because we can does not necessarily mean we should. We are living in a world now where climate change is now in crisis mode. In crisis mode, and the people who are being most affected by that crisis are the most marginalized people in the world. Because where do we dump all of our computer waste? Who lives in the lowest lying areas with no means of escape? Who is most affected by industrial waste? Just because we can does not necessarily mean that we should. What moral and spiritual progress have we made to keep pace with our scientific advances? Do you know that cryptocurrency is one of the worst things for the environment because of the enormous power it takes to run all the servers that bank it? It requires enormous power. It seems harmless because it's out there in the ether. And yet it's one of the worst things for the environment. Have we considered the ethics of what we are doing? Perhaps you've heard the phrase, live simply that others may simply live. Now, I'm not asking you all to give up everything you own and to move out to the country and live solely by what you can produce on the land. I'm not. We live in a global society, but we must consider the entire supply chain and how everyone is affected along the way by the choices that we make. And we must look to how we can improve everyone's lot and not just our own. Reverend Dr. King talks about capitalism. Perhaps you knew and perhaps you didn't, but he advocated for socialism. Capitalism, unfettered. My friends, I'm going to tell you, I think it's killing us. The wealth divide that he talks about here in 1956 is so much worse now. It's so much worse now. And part of our difficulty in reining in the COVID pandemic has been our capitalist mentality. People who have gone to work feeling ill because they're afraid of getting fired, because they have no sick days. Because they've been enculturated to believe, well, there's nobody else to cover my shift. Because we've put the dollar ahead of everything else. What if we had decided as a nation that we would make sure that everyone, no matter what, had a minimum income? What if we decided as a nation that healthcare didn't have to be tied to your job? Beloveds, it is affecting our health, but it is affecting the marginalized most of all. And make no mistake, the marginalized are overwhelmingly people of color, and people trapped in a cycle of poverty. That's not to say that there aren't white people trapped in a cycle of poverty, but much higher percentages of people of color are trapped in that cycle. What if we decided that productivity was not the greatest prize of all? He said, you are prone to judge the success of your profession by the index of your salary and the size of the wheelbase on your automobile, rather than the quality of your service to humanity. What if we could shift our mindsets? What if we could stop exploiting the poor? Now he tells us, in your struggle for justice, let your oppressor know that you are not attempting to defeat or humiliate him. He uses gendered language. It was 1956. You are not attempting to defeat or humiliate him, or even to pay him back for injustices that he has heaped upon you. As we work to right the wrongs that have been committed, there are terrible backlashes. And why? Because people who have been in a position of power for so long are so afraid that the oppressed will do to them what the oppressors have been doing for so long. This is the way that oppressors know, and they are afraid that if marginalized people get power, the marginalized will oppress the former oppressors. Are people angry? Sure. Sure. If you've ever been put down or oppressed, you know what that feels like. And if you haven't been, if you've been in power for a long time, and someone is now asking for power, and you feel like that's oppression, I'm going to ask you to step back for a minute and ask yourself, is that really oppression? Is sharing the space really oppression? Or is it just that I've been in power for so long, I don't know what it feels like to share this space? Now, I want you to understand that Dr. King's family has asked the nation not to celebrate his birthday tomorrow. They don't want us to celebrate his birthday until the voting rights legislation has been passed, because that is a huge way that white people, primarily white people in power, are still oppressing people of color. Reverend Dr. King was working for voting rights in the 1950s. This letter was written 65 years ago, over 65 years ago. And we are still working for voting rights today, my friends. It is 2022. So how can we be allies? How can we be allies in this fight? Well, you can call your senators, because the House has passed this legislation. Call your senators. If you live in Pennsylvania, your senators are Bob Casey and Pat Toomey. And if you live in New Jersey, your senators are Cory Booker and Bob someone that you probably know. Or you can look him up. Call your senators and tell them you want the voting rights bill, the John Lewis bill, passed now. It is well past time. It is well past time. That's one concrete way that we can be allies together. Another way is when we're doing work together. To not assume, if you're white, to not assume that you know best. Wow, I had to unlearn that so much myself. I grew up in a culture where knowing the right answer was so important. And of course, I want to help. But it's really important for those of us who have privilege in these areas to stop and listen. And then to say, how can I best help you? How can I best be of service here? What do you want me to do? And not to assume that we know best. We also cannot assume that people of color will be our teachers. And if you are a person of color listening today, I am asking you, how can I best help you? And I'm not going to tell you what to do, because it's not my place. Not in this way. Now I've looked at the chat just for a moment, and I see that Nancy says she has a letter from Senator Toomey why he doesn't support the John Lewis voting rights bill. It doesn't matter. Call his office anyway. He needs pressure from his constituents. I don't care that he doesn't support it. He needs pressure from his constituents. Call his office anyway. Let your senators know where you stand on this. Beloveds, we will not build the beloved community until we understand that we are one community together. We cannot make Reverend Dr. King's dream a reality until we are willing to examine ourselves and do the work together. Are you with me? Can I get some amens? Are you with me? Are you with me? Beloveds, namaste.